Hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of your virtual summer series at WindSong. I have never been to WindSong before, and so I am probably a new name to you. My name is Steve Higginbotham, and I am the preacher for the church in Knoxville, Tennessee, the Carnes congregation. We are the home of what used to be called the East Tennessee School of Preaching. It is now called the Southeast Institute of Biblical Studies, and I'm also one of the instructors there. But I want to thank you for inviting me to be with you. Usually when I go somewhere and speak for the very first time, I always have to answer two questions before I get started. And I really don't need to do that today, but I want to tell you why and what those questions are. You see, I'm 6'6" tall. And whenever I go somewhere for the very first time, people will come to me and look up and they'll say, "How tall are you?" And I'll say, "I'm 6'6". And then the following question is always, "Did you play basketball?" And so in order to just get people's minds off of my height and so forth, I always start by saying, let me just answer two questions. I'm 6'6", and yes, I played basketball. I've heard tall jokes all my life. And, there comes a point where somebody's saying, "How's the weather up there?" It just gets a little old. And so years ago, I decided I was going to come up with a comeback to that. And I did. And I was in West Virginia preaching. And a man came up to me right after I preached and just bumped up into my chest and looked up at me and said, "How tall are you anyway?" Just said it kind of hateful. And I said, "I'm 6'6". And he said, "Well, I bet you played basketball." And I said, "Oh, I did." And with that, he just turned and walked away. And I said, "Well, wait a second. How tall were you?" And he said, I'm 5'4". And I said, "I bet you played miniature golf, didn't you?" Well, he turned a little bit red. I don't know if he appreciated that much, but I felt really good about saying it. But anyway, I don't have to say any of that to you, but I just shared that story. As I said, I have never been to Little Rock. I've only been to Arkansas a couple times in my life. But I'll tell you, I know a lot about the church there. When I graduated from Freed-Hardeman in 1984, I was starting out preaching, and I wanted to get my hands on good material. And back in that day, there wasn't an internet, and what I knew from other preachers was often written. And so I subscribed to the Sixth and Izard Church Bulletin way back, probably 1984, 1985. And I've been taking your bulletin ever since. And so though I've never been there, I know a lot about the church there. And John Gibson is a wonderful writer. And that's why I took the bulletin, because I wanted some material that had good instructional articles in it. And he was and is such a good writer that I wanted to get that bulletin. And I still take your bulletin to this day. So anyway, I want to thank you for that and all the help that you have been to me and the encouragement through the articles that have been written. Tonight, what I would like to do with you is to share some thoughts about a topic I don't think we talk nearly enough about. And this topic is the presence of God. When's the last time you heard someone talk about the presence of God? There are certain topics that maybe are just presuppositions. We know God is there. We know He sees everything, but we just don't give a whole lot of attention to it or a lot of thought to it. And I really think it would be helpful, practical, if we would consider more the presence of God in our life. You don't have to live very long until you find that life can be really difficult. Now, some people just seem to glide through life and everything just lays down for them and life is so smooth. But for others of us, it's one obstacle, one tragedy, one heartbreak after another, and life is a whole lot more difficult. It's during those times that I think people often leave the Lord. They shake a defiant fist at God. If you love me, why? Is a question that is often asked. And what I'm trying to get at this evening is that if we would consider the presence of God, we would realize that his presence serves as an anchor for our soul. When we're tossed about in the storms of life, and when we don't, all we can do is just hang on, the presence of God is a real help to us. And I think we've neglected that help in the past. You know, I heard a story about a lady who was, this happened about 90 years ago, and she had electricity run to her house. And she was so thrilled about this electricity that comes to her home, and light bulbs just light up, and it was just amazing. And so she was so thankful when the workers left. She appreciated their work and thanked them profusely, and off they go. And a couple months later, they come back to the house to check, and they said, "Are you having problems with your electricity?" And she said, No, I love it. It's wonderful. And they said, "Well, we don't understand that because we've been reading your meter and it's barely turning. You're not using any electricity." And she said, "Oh no, I'm using it. It's wonderful." And so they said, "Well, how are you using it? What are you doing?" And she said, "Oh, it's the greatest thing. I mean, I wait till it gets dark. And when it gets dark, I go over and I flip the switch on to turn the light on so that I can see to light my candles. And it's wonderful." Well, I think she missed the value, and she wasn't taking advantage of the power of electricity. And I think that while we may know that God is with us, I think we're like that lady a lot. We don't appreciate the power that is ours if we would just realize his presence in our life. And so let me share with you just 3 or 4 points tonight that I believe are really practical and will help us to be better people as we serve the Lord. The first point is this, that God made a promise to be with us. And the presence of God is either to us a threat or it's a comfort. In Psalm 139, there's that passage, and you can turn there if you want, and you can begin at the first, but if you want to begin in verse 8, it gets right to the heart of it. But the psalmist says, "Where can I go to flee from the presence of the Lord? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol or hell, you're there. If I hide in the recesses of darkness, it's like daylight to you. There's nowhere that I can go where you can't see me." Now, depending on how we live our life, that's either a blessing or a curse. That either gives us comfort or it threatens us and discomforts us. To the person who's not living right, the omniscience of God, him knowing everything and his omnipresence being everywhere, that can be scary. He sees everything you do. But also the presence of God can be a comfort. And I think that's what this passage was intended to be in the first place. I don't think the psalmist is writing, "Man, I can't get by with anything because God is there and he sees everything. I can't do anything and get away with it." I think what he was saying is, because God is everywhere, I can sigh a sigh of relief because I know he's with me. You know, my wife and I have 4 children. And they're all grown now. My youngest is in Higginbotham, still a student in college. But when our oldest daughter reached the age to go to kindergarten, I remember that first day of school, and boy, I didn't like it, but she was so ready to go to kindergarten. And I remember she had this little pink princess backpack, and she had that on, and she's standing by the van getting ready to go load up for school. She's so excited. And I said, Kelly, you don't want to leave your dad and go off to school, do you? And she just put her hands on her hips and said, now, Daddy, you know I have to go to kindergarten. And so off she went, and she had to get on a bus. And that bus met right at the end of our driveway, and she climbed on that bus. But you know what I did that day? I got in my car, and I followed her bus all the way to school. And I watched her get off the bus and go inside the school. And you know where I was at 2:30 in the afternoon that same day? I was in the parking lot across the street, and I watched her get back on the bus, and I stayed with her until she got all the way home. Why did I do that? Did I do that to catch her doing something wrong? Was I like, Kelly, I saw you and you messed up. You did something I told you not to. That's not why I was watching. That's not why I was following her and that I saw every move she made that day. The reason I was with her that day was because I wanted to be sure that I was there if anything happened and if she needed my help. That's how I picture the presence of God. God's not hanging out, looking over our shoulder, just waiting to pounce on us when we make a mistake. No, his presence is a promise. It's a comfort to us to know that I have a Father who's all powerful, and he's looking out for me and is with me every day. And that gives me peace of mind. Does it not you? We should think about that. When we're in the throes of some of the worst things that can happen to us, we need to remember, my God is with me, and he's watching, and he can take care of me. So that's the first thing. I want you to ask yourself this question. The presence of God, is that a threat or a comfort to you? I hope for all of us, we find that as a comfort. But here's the second point that I want to make with you. And it's this: there is a promise of God's presence. He's not just going to do it from time to time, every once in a while. He's going to be with us all the time. Do you remember the promise that he made his apostles when he gave them the Great Commission in Matthew 28, verses 19 and 20? He said, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I've baptizing and teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I've commanded you." And then remember what he said? "And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the world." I'm going to be with you as you do my will, even till the end of the age or to the end of the world. In John chapter 14, Jesus made a great promise. He said, those who love me and love my word, my Father and I will come and dwell with you. What a great promise to know that always God is with me. And what that will do is it'll make me a better person. Being 6'6", I like to play basketball, and I played a lot of basketball when I was younger. And even after I got out of college, I would go to the Y on certain nights of the week, and we would play, and guys would be there, and we'd just pick up teams and so forth. And then during the course of the evening, we would take a break in a game and slide down on one of the walls and sit there, and somebody would say, "So, what do you do for a living?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm the preacher at the Church of Christ down the road here." And then they would go, "Oh, hey, I'm sorry about saying that one thing on the court. If you heard me say it," and people start changing immediately because I'm a preacher. Well, I understand that. But I also understand that if I know that God is with me and he hears and sees everything I do, I know that'll help make me a better person as well. If you had to live a day walking and working with the elders of your church, would that affect the way you behaved? If you had one of the most respectable gospel preachers you know come and stay in your house for a couple nights, would it change what you watched on TV? Would it make you better people? You see what I'm saying? If we can influence people to be better, what does the presence of God do in our life, and how much better should that make us? There's an Old Testament story in 2 Samuel chapter 6. David has wanted to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. And he puts it on a new cart, and it should have been carried by the Levites, the Kohathites. But he puts it on a cart, and it's carried, and the oxen stumble, and it starts to tip over. And you remember the man reaches up and tries to steady it with his hands, and he's struck dead because he had disobeyed God. Well, that made David mad. And David throws a little pout to God. And so he just says, hey, take this thing up here to this guy's house, a man by the name of Obed-Edom. And David just went back home and pouted for a while. But for 3 months, the Ark of the Covenant, the very presence of God on earth, dwelt in a man's house. How do you think that affected that man and his family? Imagine, I don't know where they put it. Maybe they just dropped it in the middle of his living room. If they did, I'm sure they had yellow tape around it, because if you touch this thing, you're going to die. But if the presence of God, and you knew that it was right there in your house, would it affect the way you talk to your parents? Would it affect the way you talk to your spouse, to your children? Would it affect what you listen to on television and listen to on your, your phones? Would it affect the websites you visited? Would it affect the videos that you watched? I think it would. The presence of God in our life, if he was literally right here with us, as he was literally in the house of Obed-Edom, it must have changed them for that period of time that he was there. I'm just saying this. Listen, we don't have the Ark of the Covenant in our house, but we do have God living in our homes. Jesus said, if you love me and you love my word, we will come. My Father and I will come and dwell with you. You may not be able to see him, but he lives in your home. And knowing that should make you a better person and should help you to live a better life. So we've got this promise, but let me tell you the practicality of it. And let's talk about the focus of God's presence. Because when we decide to focus on this and not make it a peripheral doctrine, oh yeah, I know God's everywhere, but we focus on the fact that he's present, do you have any idea how that'll change your life? There's an example in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 3. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were commanded to bow down and worship this image that Nebuchadnezzar had made, and they wouldn't do it because they were loyal and faithful to God. Nebuchadnezzar got word about it, and because he liked him, he gave him a second chance, but they would not bow down, and that infuriated him. And so he heated up this oven, hotter than 7 times hotter than it was supposed to be, and had them thrown into the fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego find themselves in this fiery furnace. Their hands had been bound, but the ropes burned off, and now their hands are loosed. And Nebuchadnezzar looks in the fiery furnace and sees not 3, but 4 men walking around in the fire. And he even asked some who were with him, said, did we not throw 3 in there? Why do I look and see 4? And the 4th one is like one of the sons of the gods, or the son of the gods. And then Nebuchadnezzar makes this statement that I think is just mind-boggling. He says this in verse 26. He says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out of the fire. Well, have you ever given that thought? Who has to be told to come out of fire? I mean, let's just suppose we build a bonfire some night and have a big, marshmallow roast after church, and it's got this big old flame, and somebody grabs somebody by the ankles and the other person has them by the wrists, and they go 1, 2, and on the 3rd they throw them in that fire. Are you just going to lay there and go, ouch, boy, ow, this is really hot. Oh, ow. You're not going to just lay there. Whether you feel the pain initially or not, you're going to jump up and scramble your way out of that fire just as quickly as you could possibly get out. Why didn't Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, why didn't they scramble out of the fire? They may not have understood why they weren't feeling the pain immediately, but this is fire, and you've just been thrown in it, and you're still capable of moving around. Would you not have just run back out? I probably would have, but I think I know why they didn't. Because they were distracted by the presence of that 4th person. There was someone, God, was with them in that fire. And the presence of God distracted them from their present concerns. And I think that's a really important lesson in life. Listen, life is going to hit you. And you're going to go through some really difficult times. And maybe some of you are going through them right now. Some of you may have gone through them in the past, and you may be looking at some things in the future that you know you're going to have to deal with. And I don't want to minimize those. They can be earth-shattering, heart-breaking. But if when I go through those things with the knowledge that God is with me, it's bearable. I can do it. The presence of God can distract me from the horrors and the pains and the fears of life. When I was just a little boy, I grew up in Chester, West Virginia. My dad preached at that congregation for 50 years. I preached for a total of 60, but 50 at that congregation. So the house there I grew up in, and there were 6 doors on the way to my bedroom at night. I would have to pass 6 openings. And when my mom and dad would say, "Hey, Steve, it's time to go to bed," I was afraid. And I was afraid because of those doors. Because each one of those doors, to me, represented an opportunity for a monster to jump out and get me. And so bedtime was hard for me. And I would often have to say, "Please take me to bed. Go with me." And that got old to my parents. So here's what I did. This is in the 1960s, you have to remember. And at that time, Batman and Robin were a big thing. You remember Batman and Robin, not the dark Batman and Robin things that you see on TV now. I'm talking about Adam West, Burt Ward, the Biff, Bam, Pow, that Batman and Robin. You remember those? That old series? I loved that show. And I rode off, and they sent me a present in the mail that made a difference to my life. And I still have it. I don't know if you can see this very well, but this is it. I got a button. It's a pin-on button. And it says this: charter member. Charter member of the Batman and Robin Society. Man, I was so glad when I got this button. I thought that was the best thing. And what I'd do is I'd pin that to my pajamas at night. And I'd walk down that hallway. Nobody's going to mess with me now because I am a charter member of the Batman and Robin Society. Listen, folks, this button, the presence of this button gave me strength to face my circumstances. If the presence of a button can help me deal with the troubles of life, what will the presence of God do for me? When my children, we have 4 children, my youngest 2, he would do this often, and that's why I mention him. But we would be maybe upstairs in our house. That's where all of our bedrooms were. And I might have forgotten my Bible downstairs. And I would say to my son, who was 6, Matthew is his name, I'd say, Matthew, I forgot my Bible. Would you mind running downstairs and getting my Bible for me? And he would go, downstairs? No one's downstairs right now. And I'd say, I know we're all up here, but could you do that for me? And he'd say, yeah, but the lights are out. It's dark. And I said, Matthew, I know it's dark. Just flip the light on, and would you go down and get my book? And then invariably, he would say to his 2-year-old sister, hey, Anne-Marie, do you want to go downstairs with me? And she'd go, sure, and he would go downstairs. What's a 2-year-old going to do to protect him if there is something downstairs that would get him? What's a 2-year-old going to do to help him? Nothing. But the presence, it's just her presence made what he thought was undoable, doable. Now later, I think I figured out why he'd do that. I think his game plan was that if there was something downstairs, he would toss her to it and make his getaway. I think that's what he had in mind. But the point is, just her presence empowered him to do what he was already uninclined to do. And friends, I'm just telling you, if we could remember the presence of God in our life, and when things hit us that hurt and they shake us and rock us to the core, if we could just remember, I'm not alone. God is with me. I can do this. It will make a real difference. So many times people do what Paul said not to do in Galatians 6 and verse 9. He said, do not grow weary in well-doing or doing good. But in due season, you'll reap if you do not faint. I know a lot of Christians who have fainted. They have given up. Circumstances have gotten hard, and they've caused them to take their eyes off of Jesus, the presence of God. They felt like they're going through it alone, and they just quit. And that's tragic. So focus on his presence. And then here's the last point. When we focus on his presence, we'll find peace from his presence. I love the 8th chapter of Romans. It's a great chapter. You need to read it periodically. But one of the things that it says at the very end of Romans chapter 8, or near the end, verse 28, says, we know, this is something we know, that all things work together for good to those who love God and to those who are the called according to his purpose. It helps me to know that God is watching and that he's with me and that he's aware of every little thing that happens to me. Just like I was when I was following my daughter to school and following her home from school. I would have been aware of whatever was going on, and I could have jumped in my limited ability to help. Well, we serve a God who sees all and is with me 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and he's all powerful. Should that not give me peace? And when bad things do happen to me, can I not find comfort and peace in the knowledge that this isn't going to end in this fashion? It's not going to be the death of me. God has promised to redeem even the bad things, the things that hurt me in this life. God will bring redemption, and he'll make it work for my good. Now, that's not a promise given to those who are in the world. But boy, I cherish that promise, to know that all the hurts and the pains of this life that really pull me down, I can rely on the fact that God said, while those things may not be fun, and they may hurt, and they're not pleasurable, I'm telling you, I will work that for your good. And I hold on tenaciously to that promise. You see, I, probably like you, have had things and events happen in my life that have broken my heart. And I hold on to that promise of God to take those bad things and eventually work them for my good. In 2 Kings chapter 6, the Syrians were at war with Israel. And the king, every step he took, the king of Syria, it was thwarted and countered perfectly by the Israelites. So he called a meeting one day and said, who is telling the Israelites everything that we're planning? We have a traitor among us, and I want whoever it is to confess. And some of his servants said, King, it's not that anybody's a traitor. We're all loyal to you. But I'll tell you what it is. The king of Israel has a prophet of God. His name is Elisha. And he tells him everything we plan, even the things that you plan at night in your bedroom. His God makes him aware of it. And so the king of Syria said, well, then we got to get him. And so they found out where he was, and they circled the city under the cover of darkness. And in the morning, the servant of Elisha went outside, and he saw them surrounded by the Syrian army. He was terrified. And he comes running back into Elisha and says, we're dead. There's nothing we can do. They have surrounded us at night, and we are so defeated. What are we going to do? You know, I can just hear the sheer panic in this man's voice. And Elisha simply says this, Lord, open his eyes. And the Lord opened his eyes, and the servant of the prophet looked out and saw that the hills were filled with fiery chariots and horses. In other words, God's presence was there. And don't you know, he had to have had a huge sigh of relief. Don't you know that all the fear and the anxiety of what could be was suddenly subsided in the knowledge that God's going to take care of me, even in this. And that can be our story too. So the presence of God, it doesn't need to just be a presupposition that we simply acknowledge, oh yeah, God is everywhere, he sees everything, let's move on to some other topic. No, we need to spend time on this topic. Not because it's just simply a Bible topic, but man, it has so much practicality to it. It will help us navigate the difficulties of this life, and it will keep our eyes lifted to heaven in the midst of worldly strife and heartache. Can I give you one passage and we'll close? In Matthew chapter 14, Jesus came walking on the water, and the disciples were on the boat, and they thought he was a ghost, and they were afraid. And Jesus said, don't be afraid, it's I. And Peter said, Lord, can I come to you? And he said, sure, come on. And Peter stepped out of the boat and walked to Jesus in the midst of storm and raging waters. But when he began to take his eyes off of Jesus and look at his circumstances, he began to sink. And there's a lesson for us. Life is hard, and you're going to face heartache and heartbreak, disappointments and pains. We live in a fallen world. And when we start to focus on all those fallen things, it begins to overwhelm us. Instead, focus on God and His presence, and He will lift you up above your circumstances. He'll give you peace and hope for something better that He's promised. I want to thank you again for inviting me to be a part of the WindSong congregation tonight. And I hope this lesson has been helpful to you. And I'll say this, if you ever come to the Smoky Mountains for a vacation, I hope you'll stop at Carnes and visit us. God bless all of you. Thank you and goodbye.